Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host Hannah Zubairi and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. On today's segment, we will be discussing the cruel and unjust murder of George Floyd, who was killed by a police officer yesterday in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Floyd, a Black man, was arrested Monday evening after officers responded to a call about an alleged forgery in progress. Videos from bystanders show Floyd handcuffed and pinned to the ground, and one police officer's knee pressing against his neck. Floyd says he's in pain and can't breathe. He was declared dead at a nearby hospital shortly afterwards. In the video, about 5 minutes into it, it's terrible video, and no one should be posting it on their social media pages. Floyd appears to go unconscious, and the bystanders ask for someone to check his pulse. The officer does not lift his knee from Floyd's neck until medical personnel arrive a few minutes later and carry him to an ambulance. Police said he was taken to Hennepin Healthcare, where he was later pronounced dead. Currently, protests are taking place in Minneapolis. No charges have so far been filed in the case. At a news conference on Wednesday, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey called on Hennepin County's attorney Mike Freeman to act on the evidence before him and press charges on the arresting officer. He said, "Why is the man who killed George Floyd not in jail? If you had done it or I had done it, we would have been behind bars right now. And I cannot come up with a good answer to that question," Frey told a news conference today. "We watched for 5 whole excruciating minutes as a white officer firmly pressed his knee into the neck of an unarmed, handcuffed Black man," he added, noting that the arresting officer was not practicing a technique donned by the city's police. "I saw no threat. I saw nothing that would signal that this kind of force was necessary," he said. Joining me today is Margari Hill. Margari Aziza Hill is an adjunct professor, a blogger, an editor, and a freelance writer with articles published in many magazines. She is the co-founder and executive director of Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative. This is an organization focused on education for liberation, anti-racism. After converted to Islam in 1993, Hill experiences as a Black American woman have informed her research and writing on Islam. She has nearly a decade of teaching experiences at all levels, from elementary, secondary, college level to adult education. She has worked in education at various capacities, including as a substitute teacher, instructor, curriculum design, school policy, teacher training, as well as a teaching assistant and teaching fellow. She's taught writing and literature at Al-Aqsa Islamic Academy, developed and instructed an art and literacy class for Clara Muhammad summer camp, and worked as a lead instructor and teacher and curriculum developer at United Muslim Masjid Summer Madrasa. So Margari is a close friend. She's someone I lean on heavily for direction and education on anti-racism and Black lives. She has a master's in history in Middle Eastern and Islamic Africa from Stanford University in 2006. Her research included colonial perceptions from mixed race identities in northern Nigeria, anti-colonial resistance amongst West Africans in Sudan during the early 20th century. She's also worked in the international student program at Al-Azhar and Cairo University, and Margari's given talks and lectures at various universities and communities throughout the country. I welcome today Margari Aziza Hill.
Alaikum salam. Thank you for having me. I mean, obviously, Eid Mubarak. I didn't get a chance to wish you the greetings, and it was a little bit hard, right? Like during, the days of Eid, we also had another case, right, um, where Christian Cooper met another Cooper, Amy Cooper, who tried to call the police on him for him to enforce the rules in the park, which is to keep your dog on a leash. So, I mean, it's racism doesn't take an Eid off. We know like during Ramadan, Shaitan is locked up, but during Ramadan, we've seen, like mass killings of Black people. We've seen, during Eid, we faced the murder of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, so, this is an all too common occurrence. SubhanAllah.
It really is. And I am in awe of the supreme amount of work that people such as yourself have to do every day, that no time to process the pain, to process it every day, and to then actually now have to set that pain aside and then work and set out fires and be consistently correcting and you know when people are trying to help, um, and but their framing is so problematic, then it's you to the rescue at all times, and I've seen this over the years. And I was just speaking to a Uyghur activist just a little while ago, and impacted people, and how it's just phenomenal. And for anybody who is listening, watching, they need to understand why it is so incumbent on us to learn and to take some of this burden off. And until we cannot do that until we study and learn how to do this properly. So this is where I want you to tell us about Muslim Arc. What does Muslim Arc, what does it do, when did it start? Please share the Muslim Arc story.
Yeah, so Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, a lot of our roots really, they really work to address anti-Blackness within Muslim communities. And, part of my background is that I've started studying race in Muslim communities in undergrad. My own background, like I worked, my undergraduate final paper, like it's like my thesis paper, was actually on the Bosnian Muslims. So I had worked with refugees in the 90s. And so like I'm coming from like an old school, like kind of like that's like my own original first like background in organizing was to address the, genocide and hope for humanitarian aid in the 90s. But in, like my graduate work from 2004 and 2009 was on the history, like looking at racial formations in Muslim communities. I traveled abroad, and that's where I first saw human trafficking. The first time I was actually where I understood the language, like the words that was coming out of somebody's mouth, and was the first time I was actually called a slave. I was in Kuwait. And I'd experienced microaggressions in Egypt because, like, for many people, like they assumed I was like from the South, or they assumed, like African, but then I had the blue passport. So I was treated a little differently because I was American. But then years later, coming back and teaching at an Islamic school after I left graduate school, and I had saw, my own students refer to us, the Black teachers, as slaves, as Abda. Like I was in line and I had to tell one of my students, like, hey, I understand Arabic, by the way, and I don't appreciate that. And then years later, so that was like in 2010, I left teaching, in 2011. And then after, with Trayvon Martin, with his murder, George Zimmerman's, like, I just saw like a deep silence from the Muslim community, or the ways that they talked about it was really harmful. Like, I felt it was really disturbing. And then I didn't really have a place for that besides like thinking about ways to develop some online courses. And I still wasn't like really connected with the larger community of doing anti-racism work. Like, I wanted to connect my own research on race, and to connect with people who would be able to address it. And so I think it was like started on social media, and that we had saw like some, we'd have like Muslims that were like free Gaza in one word, but still using like on their profiles and still using anti-Black language, switching to Arabic to call Black people slaves, and then using slurs, and so when I was connected with Namira Islam, who had reached out to several, like 20 American Muslim leaders to address anti-Blackness, which on social media, which also included the erasure of over 25% of of Muslims who are Black Muslims. And whether we had like our Eid, like the hashtags of celebrating Eid, or listicles of what Muslims were doing, there was just this deep erasure of Black Muslims. And so, when I was put in contact with her in the group, like several of us, we were able to commit, and and that included Diala Khalifa, Maith El Hassan, Hinda Mekki, and Namir Islam, and myself. And so we all committed to pushing out 4 hashtag campaigns during Black History Month. And we weren't quite sure, like what we wanted to start out with. Before I joined the group, they, one of the hashtags that were floated up was being Black and Muslim. And that was a pretty neutral term, right? And so that allowed for, like, we're just like, let's start with that rather than starting Black History Month addressing anti-Blackness. Let's let Black Muslims speak for themselves and share their stories. And from that hashtag in 2014, there was so many great stories of pride and culture, of what people, like what Black Muslims loved about being Muslim, about being Black, and sharing their cultural heritage, the diversity of the Black Muslim community, right? Like coming from like African American, Afro-Caribbean, of the many countries in Africa that were represented on the hashtag was really beautiful. But there was also a tremendous amount of heartbreak that came through that. And that was like the betrayal of like feeling, experiencing racism. And what we found was that it was so widespread that we couldn't say that these were isolated incidents. And some of the comments that we did hear, and similar for me, was that issues that were a concern for us as Muslims of the African diaspora, and those who are facing racial oppression in the United States in particular, those issues were not on the top of the agenda of any of the Muslim advocacy groups, of the civil rights work, of addressing that in faith spaces and, khutbahs. And so from that conversation, when it trended globally, we knew there was a few opportunities that we had to address this issue. And then, when those conversations would start, sometimes like they would start, and if they didn't continue, they would, it'd be another 7 to 10 years before that conversation would come up, whether that was in a conference or doing the real deep work that we needed to do. So we decided to like look the best way, like, and Namira had done work in human rights education, and my work was as an educator, and we both had some design background, so I was into design-based thinking. So you look at a problem and you try to like reverse engineer, like think through ways of how do you solve it. And so we decided to work on looking at the model of making anti-racism education accessible to the aunties, to the uncles, to the youth, to people who weren't in college, to really begin to have really difficult conversations. And part of that, even during Black History Month, was a call to, like, we had a letter that we asked imam, that we sent to imams to ask them to bring up issues around racial oppression, to make sure that they included African countries in their in
Yeah.
their khutbas, rather than erase, like when they would talk about like particular issues. And, even shortly after that, we also had the call for justice, like for the Rohingya, because we also found that issue to be erased. And so our work was really to try to lift up those who are marginalized at Muslim Arc and to have those difficult internal conversations. Now, around this time, oh, yeah, around this time 6 years ago, when Eric Garner was killed, it brought up a lot of sorry, I not usually tell this story and I'm usually like okay about it, but it brought up my own sixth grade memories of Christmas time. And when my mother had to go back home, it's like she had to go back to New Jersey because her brother, my only uncle, was killed by the police. And I just thought about all the times, like all that we lost to that, and like the many encounters that I had, my brother had with law enforcement. And I was like, where are the Muslims in that? And so I wrote my first article. And saying that Muslims should stand up because I hadn't seen anything at that time. And there was so much silence. There was so much silence around Trayvon, and there was so much silence. And so short like during that summer when Mike Brown was killed, a few of us, like I saw like something written by clergy, and I had not seen anything like that in the Muslim community. So I kind of basically copied that letter. Like I was just like, of where the clergy, they had asked um, people to stand, pray, learn, study. And so in our toolkit, I had listed out some actions from that letter, of like how we need to pray to deepen our understanding of this and how we needed to pray and address these issues, how we needed to understand systemic racism and police brutality. And so, that was like, that began that journey. And so, even in that early time, like I was in contact with Suad Abdul Khabir, who's a brilliant scholar of like American Islam and race. And then there's and they're both Dr. Suad Abdul Khabir, and then now Dr. Camila Mu'min Rashad. And we all wrote a letter like asking, a call for justice. And we asked Black imams to like stand, to make a statement, and so that we can have support from, and this stuff was like really hard because, like there's a lot of silencing, right? At this time, there's a lot of like Muslim lives matter. Like we didn't even get people to say Black lives matter. They didn't feel comfortable saying that. And so, when Dr. Suad's mother shared that with old school imams in Brooklyn, who signed on, and that really fortified us to be able to go forward and say something. There was a lot of, like I know there was like Muslims for Ferguson, and so there's people that went on the ground, but there was also so many Muslims, like when Mike Brown, yeah, like when the whole mainstream media, the way that they covered Ferguson was so ridiculous and sanitized, and they did not even cover, like it was like people like Bassem El Masri, even Umar Lee, who I know from the blogging days, and there was another brother, I think his name is Talal, like, and they were like on the ground, sharing videos and pictures of like a military occupation of Ferguson. And it was just like so shocking, just the silence that we heard from mainstream Muslims and people blaming people, the rioters, like they called them rioters rather than it being an uprising. And these are people that were like really gung-ho about the Arab Spring. But yet, when you talk about like Black people rising up to say like, we don't want to take this anymore, like having statements of like valuing property, being more concerned over property over like people's lives, and just seeing the brutalization of people. And now, 6 years later, how many of the Ferguson protesters have passed, including Bassem Masri? And I'm just really thinking about him and lifting up his work, because had he not just had all those videos, so many people on Twitter would not have seen, seen them. And so it's not always easy to be here and, like, from my safe apartment during social isolation, knowing that there's people like Jaylani Hussein who, these people are putting their lives on the line because we're under social isolation, right? And we should be, like, sheltering in place, but yet we have to, like, they have to march, right? To, like, call for not just a firing, because they could get fired and just placed in another place, like placed in another job. Like, they're calling for their arrest. So, like, they won't ever go back in the force. And it's so, and you see how they're met, right? Like, and you've had, like, white alt-right protesters protesting lockdown, and they were completely safe. And, like, look at the pictures of how they're treating the people of Minneapolis right now. And it's absolutely heartbreaking. Yeah. Biological weapon, like, chemical warfare.
There's tear.
Yes. And so
Exactly. We saw this in Baltimore too. It was terrible, and the same thing. No,
so
and we have to watch really carefully how this is being covered, and use that, like, the whatever people have built up, whatever platforms they have built up to address this, that this, you cannot keep looking at this as rioting. This is people upset because one of their own has been killed again and again and again. And we afford that to people overseas, but we do not afford that over here in our streets. And yes, please continue.
Yeah, it's just like how, like, when Black people marching, how that's criminalized. And if you want to think about how people would have looked at, like, the civil rights people, we look at them with so much courage, right? But, like, people saw them as a threat. People saw like the Martin Luther King, like, they were like, I've talked with people that lived during that time and said, like, yeah, I was like, my grandmother was afraid of him. Or they saw the, like, freedom riders as troublemakers. They saw them as, like, like the people that stirred up problems, And so, I mean, if you want to think about what we would have done during the civil rights movement, during the time of Malcolm X, you could look at what we do right now. And so, so for me, like, the major shift in Muslim Arc really happened, like, where we had to not just think about what was happening within internal Muslim communities, but that Muslims had to look at systemic racism as a whole, because otherwise, we run the risk of just creating only exceptional Black people who would be accepted. But those same people, the same Muslims who move out to suburbs because they do not want to live, they look at Black neighborhoods, majority Black neighborhoods, as unsafe. That these same people who don't open their doors when my friend's husband goes and delivers kanafa to their house, and they're afraid to open their door and say thank you to delivery people. These are Muslims, right? Like, what would we do in our own gated neighborhoods, right? And so, like, what would they do if they saw my brother or my 6'5" nephew? So it's not just okay for them not to be racist against me, that as an anti-racism organizer, that I needed, like, Muslims in general to understand anti-Black racism, to understand the mass incarceration, and to see police brutality as part of a long history, that this is not just something that is, like, bad apples, but there's a culture of policing, that policing itself had functioned in ways to oppress Black people in the United States. And, and that we have to make that connection, right? Like, we have to make that connection to global issues, but we also have to make that connection to our own biases. And that was, like, the importance of what we're doing at Muslim Arc. We could look at, okay, like, those are bad cops, and no one, and if we shouldn't have to, but, like, the fact that there was, whether it was like Ahmaud Arbery, that story was circulating for a long time, and people weren't outraged until they saw the video of his murder, right?
Mhm.
and the same thing with George Floyd, like the voyeurism, the disrespect of Black bodies. That was something I saw, and I'm gonna make the connection because, like, for those who are a little bit older, and or for those who weren't there, but in the 90s when the Rwandan genocide occurred, like the dehumanization of like Black people was so apparent and blatant. And that you had, even in those internet, like the UN did nothing. And just like people just showed Black people slaughtered. And that
Mhm.
was something that's long been part of the history. The same thing of like looking at what happened with George Floyd and that the visual spectacle of that and Ahmaud Arbery is like people went to picnics to like look at my ancestors being lynched, right? Like that's what my grandfather, he had fled Georgia out of conflict. The last cogent story that my grandmother told was of how she, like if she was down the road, how she had to hide if she saw a group of white men in Jim Crow South. And so those are
Mhm.
like the family stories and the trauma that's part like, and trauma impacts your DNA. The trauma doesn't go away, and there's things that we have to process. Like we have to process all that. And we carry all of that within our family history of forced migration and dispossession. But every time that there's no safe space, we could move to the suburbs and we face that. You could be the most helpless. You could be a mentally ill Muslim woman with, and and if you're Black, you get gunned, like Shukri Ali get gunned down. Amadou Diallo was just showing his wallet, and he was gunned down. So like you having, for us as Black Muslims, we know all too well that our faith, while so important to us, doesn't shield us from police brutality. In fact, the only clergy, the only imam who's been killed has been killed, like is the Black imam who's killed by law enforcement. So that's Lukman Abdullah, and we still have political prisoners that like who are through solitary confinement and all sorts of, he's like, that Jamil El Amin is still, even though there's like so much evidence that he didn't do it, but they're still not going through like looking at his case again. And so there's a petition that we're asking people to sign. And so I'm hoping that through our own increased awareness of not just being outraged, right? That one, it's like, if we can remove something, we use it with our hands. And part of our hands would be dialing the DA and making a demand that those 4 officers be, tried, so like they need to go through, because that was a criminal act. Their highest duty is to protect people, not to murder people. We need to look
Mhm.
at different changes into making sure that there's greater oversight, right, for police officers, that there's greater accountability towards like how they treat citizens and non-citizens, residents of the people that they're trying to protect. And like I think we should all support the activists who are working on the ground, and to make sure that, like if we can do something with our hands, if we could be in Minneapolis and many of us can't, what we can do is be engaged witnesses and lift up their stories. We can speak, and support. We have every right, and we shouldn't be afraid of getting on some type of list, like I'm on a list, whatever. We just keep it moving, because it's like they can't hurt all of us, right? And so, we can speak up for the people that are being hurt. We need to make those connections. We can and we have to hate it in our hearts. Like we have to understand that even with the coronavirus, that the police killings have not gone down. And that in
Mhm.
fact, during pandemics, it gets worse, like the vigilantism that we're seeing right now. And so we are in a dangerous time. That's why a lot of people are asking
Mhm.
us to be vigilant about sharing. Don't share his murder. Don't share it anymore. Take it off your timeline. That's further victimizing him. And that if anything happens to one of us, believe us, right? Like we did not believe Ahmaud Arbery's murder until
Mhm.
like and we shouldn't have to, just knowing the patterns, right? Um, I think
There
so.
are, you know,
Yeah.
you to talk, if you can't have this bandwidth to talk about Breonna Taylor, for
Yeah.
her to be in her home, to be doing nothing, just being in her home. And sometimes female victims, a lot of times, their stories are not as amplified as some of the others. And
Yeah,
yeah,
say her name. Like if you're support lifting up because, there are women, black women that are incarcerated, they're like innocent, right? Like they're in jail facing a death sentence with COVID, right? Like they're Breonna Taylor's like that is like yeah, like her killing it's just shocking, but it's just like, like we've had little girls killed in raids, nobody should be able to break into your home, kill you, including law enforcement. I know Muslims whose spouse like just shot, like the police came, raided their house and shot them and just left and was like, oh, sorry, my bad. Like how is that possible? So it's like what we do need is like real deep awareness that this happens all too often. The rare cases we have videos, right? And so like, but we need to look at what's happening locally, right? Like what's happening, what are these, like move beyond the statistics, make sure that we understand that that yes, like the vulnerability of Black life is across genders, it's across age. We've seen like elderly, you could be like the most, you know, ideal person, veteran, Harvard grad. Anytime, we have to think about like, when are we calling the police for a suspicious person? And that's where I'm just saying it's like, even for Muslims, they have to be very vigilant about their own biases and consider like, hey, if there's some type of conflict or I like looking down the street, is that bias? Like, am I going to call police on this person? Am I going to like extend this, or am I going to like, not only like maybe it's not that over police situation, but it's the slight things of like, say a Black person may write you a text of saying like, I didn't like this, and then the same person will act like, make the Black person sound so aggressive, like, and especially Black women, like we're made as like aggressive and criminal all the time in our organizing and activism. And that's like what is just really, really troubling, and is like how layered this is, and like what does this do to demoralize the movement, like to demoralize a centuries long struggle, right, towards a Black freedom movement. I also want to like kind of ground this work in like history, right? Like, I had the real blessing of being on advisory of a committee to the equal. It was like a delegation of Muslim and Arab and South Asian organizers who were like of all faith backgrounds, who were able to go to the Equal Justice Initiative, which is like in Montgomery, Alabama. And so it was, it was like really powerful to see the connection between slavery and to see the trajectory of mass incarceration. The fact that you have America with 5% of the population, but just like the largest prison population in the world, that you have people who are giving like basically slave labor, right? Like in prisons, and now like subject to COVID, and that you have, you know, it's it was just really striking to see that also like it was connected to like right after the end of slavery was like the criminalization of Black people to put them back to work for free, like for unpaid labor, but also the lynchings, and that lynchings were reduced when there was an uptick, like as mass incarceration and executions, right, like where it was like sanitized versions of executions of Black people increased. And that having so many Black people on like death row of life, having life sentences. And so that museum was like a very powerful and visceral experience, and I hope that everyone gets a chance to see that and connect that with the with the Black freedom struggle. the other part was like the lynching memorial, which was like so powerful. And to think about what does that look like today, right, with extrajudicial killings, and to think about all of those people, and like to look at
Mm,
and to take people who had not known that history and then seen that connection and how normalized it was. And I think that's also the other part too, like of understanding the historical institutions that work to protect Black lives. And that was like what the NAACP was founded. Ida B. Wells, who was an
mm,
amazing organizer. She was a journalist. So journalism, she shed light on lynchings, and her life was threatened for doing so. And this is like in the late 19th century, but she was one of the founders of the NAACP. And so for me, like, I consider Muslim Arc's work in working on popular education is to provide both the historical, some of the historical training, but also like in, education, but also the ways that we can work to organize, but we could also do the transformational work of uprooting all the, like, the ignorance, all the bias that we've been taught through years and years of like media representation, of literature, of how our parents um talk about people, talk about the other, and particularly like the anti-Blackness that is perpetuated in a white supremacist society. And so doing the work at Muslim Arc, like in 2014, like that summer was the most transformational work. And it was the hardest because I had to get to the ways that all of the Black men in my family, whenever they step out the house, I had to worry about them. Were they going to come back home because
mm,
of the vulnerability of their life? And I also had to think about myself. And I thought about like so many traumatic memories that I have, that one day, if I count them, like, I think people have gotten a sprinkling of here or there where I've shared stories such as like we've had a home invasion one time and then they threatened to arrest my mother, like, so it's just kind of, those kind of things, that even calling the police for your own safety or the safety of someone that you love who's harming themselves can lead to their death. It's something that we can absolutely do to, we absolutely must do something to address. And now, and especially now during the age of COVID, that we have to really stand up and envision that we could have a better world, a safer world, where Black life doesn't have to be so imperiled.
I'm so grateful for you to be here and be able to, you know, you're doing this extremely hard work. What if you could give us in a few, if a person who has never entered this field, like let's talk to someone who's never, there's a lot of people talking to other advocates and other activists and critiquing and all of that. Let's talk about people who have never, but this has moved them. What can they do? What was the first step that they can take right now?
Yeah, well, I think the first step is to pledge to become committed, right? So like, I mean, Muslim Arc has a pledge, there's other pledges, but to make a commitment to say, look, I'm going to learn, and I'm going to learn with others who are committed to the work. And so I would say, take the pledge, if you can. It's like pledge.muslimark.org. We're here as a resource for that. Read more. I mean, our toolkit hasn't been updated, but you could see the steps that you could take to support, Black Lives Matter movement. Support Black life, like support the activists who are working, you know in your city. Find out if it's not your nearest city, find them and support them. There's so many steps, but I think that um you know being able to assess where you're at, but also have like, whether it's a weekly commitment, right, of like learning more, of making sure that you could find out some anti-racist action that you could take, um, to address this system. At
Yeah.
this point, I mean, I would say the second part is like, listen, like once you do that kind of self-assessment, and Melissa Mark has some self-assessments that we'll share out again. Make sure, like, follow us on social media. Like, sometimes that's the easiest way to reach us. And well,
Mhm.
I've tried not to spam people as much content, as many appearances as I've had every week. The Black Muslim COVID Coalition, so it's like Black Muslim Coalition, we produced webinars for the general public, and also to learn more with us and to support, because given, I mean, this is like, it's a double layer of trauma, that you've had, disproportionate killings. Everybody's not like, this, and then you have people that are dying at a disproportionate rate, getting infected with COVID and like being laid off. So like, you have people at a heightened stress level. I mean, I know, like, even for me, it's like, it is obviously like heightened with the workload that we've had to do to try to disseminate information, trying to get people to resources, um, even within our own community, of like holding space, but also sending whatever that we could to support those who came down with COVID. Um, and so, like, we definitely need like mutual aid. I would say, definitely, like, wherever there's the work, whether it's happening in Georgia, there is a case like Care Georgia has Brother Yassine Muhammad, who was shot on May 9th. Um, Make a call, just make a call and ask for an investigation anytime there's somebody, whether they threw a rock, if they're saying they had a knife, if they're saying anything, even if they say that the brother has a gun, because there needs to be an investigation, a full blown investigation, because people lie, and there's a lot of cover up. So we need to have a full investigation and another oversight committee, like, just, make sure that we do that. And we have to keep the pressure on, because like, Ahmaud Arbery's murders would have still been walking free had not, like, there been our outrage. And
Exactly.
so we have to keep the calls up, keep the calls up in Minneapolis, keep the calls up in Atlanta, keep the calls up, so that we just end the corruption that allows cops that kill people to just be on duty to possibly kill more people. We know one of those officers
Wow.
was straight up racist and killed a Native American. We got to protect our Native American brothers and sisters who are also getting impacted by COVID, and are also, like, as a group, totally disproportionately, like, they are getting killed by police at astonishing rates. And given the history of this country as a settler colony,
Colon.
as like the ways that it has denied Native Americans, like indigenous peoples, their rights to sovereignty, it is absolutely imperative that we show solidarity and call for full investigations, and like, and an end to the impunity of law enforcement of killing um, our Native American brothers and sisters.
No, that is, thank you so much for that. I know so many people who have benefited from the self assessment test that you were talking about, that is provided by Muslim Mark. If people can join in, and it's free, you just log in, you make an account, and you just take the test for yourself, and realize the implicit biases that you have within yourself to take, and then, and it's important for everybody. Imagine if you're a healthcare worker. Imagine if you yourself, you might be on the front line because doing COVID work, and many of our Muslim community is. But imagine if you are doing that with implicit biases. What actions are you taking within your hospital? Are you giving the same amount of attention to your Black patients as you are to your white patients? A lot of this is, it's, you might not think it has anything to do with you, but it it has everything to do with in whatever workspace you're in. You could be a manager in a corporate organization and be treat your black employees or black subordinates in a worse way than you would be your white subordinates. You could be a hiring manager and be doing the same exact replicating that white supremacy
Mhm.
within yourselves, and you don't even realize that you're doing this. So I really urge you to educate. Like when we are, especially here at Justice for All, when we're constantly working on educating others on genocidal intent or hate and all of that, and if we can't turn that inward and look at what we're doing here and what is happening here, and we've
Mhm.
talked about this earlier as well, that there are many people in the Black community who do believe that this is a genocide against their people, because it doesn't end. It doesn't. We may think, oh, because it just is brought to our attention. But if you look at the statistics and see how many Black people are killed on, just in 2019, the amount of people that were killed by police is un and none of these police officers have been brought to justice. Police killed
Yeah.
1,099 people in 2019. Black people were 24% of those killed, despite only being 13% of the population. There were only 27 days in 2019 when police did not kill someone. How in this in this country where we um, it's possible. You see in other countries where police do not kill because they are not trained in that way. So there's so much more that we could be doing. How what get in touch with your police departments here in Maryland, in Prince George's County. Like, just get, even like, there are rules. A lot of people times think there aren't laws. There are laws that govern police departments. They are supposed to be committees, and they're supposed to be rules and reports. But a lot of times, because nobody's checking and nobody's concerned, a report won't come up for 3 years and no one will care. So all of these things are things that you yourself can do. There are many organizations. If you don't want, you don't have to start something new. There's so much that's already being done. If you could help amplify that work, donate to Muslim Arc so they can continue doing the work. There's other organizations within your communities. Find out who they are. If this troubles you, it's not okay to just post online. This is, yes, it's good for awareness, but God, when are we going to get beyond just raising awareness, right? When are we going to move beyond that? So, and I'm so grateful, Marjorie, and I pray for you and your help and your family, because it's hard being alone, and I know I've seen it with my own eyes, the sort of vitriol that you get targeted by, the sort of um, erasure of your work, the erasure of your capabilities and expertise. And may Allah grant you the best in the deen, dunya, and akhirah, and give you that strength. And may Allah make us your helpers. Everybody who is watching today, everybody who comes upon this, please visit Muslim Arc, Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, and join the work. There's so much work to be done. Thank you so much for being here, and um, inshallah, we'll follow up. And you gave a very good suggestion about calling the DA's office. So inshallah, we'll put an action alert out on that to get people to target the DA's office in Minnesota today, and as the days move forward.
Thank you.
Um,
And I'll send a link to the self-assessment. I was trying to find it like really fast, but it's like, so we do like the behavior because, like there's the implicit bias, but we hope that we can all like step up our own anti-racism behavior. I know I don't have a perfect score. I have lots of work to do. And I just hope folks join us for the journey. I've learned a lot along the way of like whatever junk have internalized and working on it. Um, and it's not too late, and even if it's just a little bit of time really makes, like, it really matters, so thank you all for the work that you do and your continual partnership, Hannah. Like, you're just really always been amazing, mashallah.